Gore here. Just wanted to give you a little preliminary comment about the series that I'm uploading, beginning with this first installment. This is a series that I did back in about the year 1990. I was 5 years or so out of law school. I've been kind of rethinking some of the things I'd learned in law school, and I did this probably as much for myself as for anybody else. Called it Values Adrift, the Rise and Imminent Demise of American Social Justice. Really an attempt to sort of survey through Western history our understanding of law, the origins of law, how we understand law, and especially to evaluate in a somewhat critical way what's happened in the 20th and actually 21st century as well, in terms of how we deal with law in our culture. And so it's kind of a broad survey. We look at various characters along the way that have had some important role to play, but all of this is simply intended to give us an understanding of that. So if that's a subject that's of interest to you, then I hope you'll kind of follow along as we upload these presentations. Once again, I recorded this in 1990, so bear in mind that was well before anybody was thinking much of the internet or preserving these recordings for posterity, So I'm going to tell you up front, the audio is, I'm going to call it fair. Not great, but I think you'll find it's okay. I've included subtitles along, so you'll not have any ambiguity as to what I'm saying if it seems a little obscure in the moment. But otherwise, I think you'll find the material interesting if this is a topic of interest to you. And so with that in mind, I'll let you get going here. This is Values Adrift.
Being something of a creature of habit, I don't know if I can handle the class being set up like this. I'm used to standing right over there and kind of addressing myself that way. So if I seem a little bit confused, hopefully that's the reason why. This class have entitled Values Adrift, the Rise and Imminent Demise of American Social Justice, which is a title that is very presumptuous. I'm aware of that, and I've had some misgivings about even using a title that was quite that sweeping, but the material that we're going to be covering, I hope, will justify having selected a title such as that. I firmly believe in the propriety of that particular name for this course. I think that's really what this course will be about. On the other hand, I don't want you to think I'm here as a prophet of doom. It's not my style or desire to simply be here pronouncing great final judgments on our whole system. I hope this can be a very positive and edifying and uplifting and encouraging and optimistic kind of treatment, but we do have somewhat a serious task before us in terms of focusing on this particular kind of material. If you're tuned in at all to the culture in which we live, I think you're aware, probably more than others, of the radical changes that have taken place just in the last maybe 2 or 3 decades, in which we see so much of what really has been taken for granted, in many ways very much put at risk. We look at what's the so-called sexual revolution. We look at changes, for example, that have taken place in the educational arena, thinking of the book recently published by Gary Bloom that I assume some of you have looked at, a good book to read, entitled The Closing of the American Mind, in which he documents some of the very significant changes that have taken place in educational philosophy in just the last couple of decades or so in our culture. In politics, in commerce, in business, medical ethics, and technology, all of these have had radical transformation in the last 2 or 3 decades. Transformation so substantial that looking at world history in general, one would have expected that it would take a couple of 100 years for these changes to occur in a given culture. And yet what we've seen is these changes have happened in a couple of decades, you see. And it should give us pause, I suppose, especially as Christian people. It should give us some momentary concern to wonder, well, what does this all mean and where is it going? What does it mean about our culture and our society? What does it mean about America? You see, what do all these things add up to as far as some sort of significance? And is there anything that we should be doing about it? Is there anything we can do about it? Well, all of those disciplines could be used to document my thesis. But I'm not using any of those. I'm choosing rather one that's rather close to my heart, which has to do with the whole question of law and how it's understood, what have been the changes, especially in terms of constitutional law, that can be seen in just the last few years, and by that I mean maybe the last 30 or 40 years, in the history of this country. What does it say to us? I think many times we pick up our newspaper and we read about a Supreme Court decision on some question. And you have to have asked yourself sometime or other, how did they get that out of the Constitution? You know, you read that somewhere in junior high civics, and you recall something of what it says, and it may seem to you that it just doesn't seem that the Constitution addressed that issue. And yet there it is, a Supreme Court decision construing the Constitution to stand for a given proposition. Even at the popular level, I mean, you don't even have to be a lawyer to wonder about the process that leads to some kinds of decisions. And that's what I'd like to address and speak to in this class over the next couple of weeks. I have, I'll give you 3 objectives at least that I have for this class. It's always good to know what the point is, and so I'm going to tell you my point up front here. But one of my objectives in this particular series is just going to be educational. My concern is that as a result of having been here, that you will feel that you've been educated on some points that are not necessarily all that prominently taught in our school system or even in law school. This is not necessarily law school material that I'm going to be passing along to you in this series. But I firmly believe that Christian people especially should be educated. We should know what's going on, and so that's very much the heart of my objective in this class. But beyond that, I'm going to tell you right up front, I'll admit it unabashedly, that I'm on a soapbox. And if you suspect that I'm here with an axe to grind, then you will be correct, that this is more than just an exercise in academics, that I don't want you to just be educated as a result of that. I want you to be mad as a result of this. I want you to feel some emotion by the time we're done. But I want your emotion to be based in understanding, not just excitement. And so I hope that if you feel something along the way, that it will still be well-informed feelings that are rational and have a good constructive objective as their ultimate consequence. But I'm here partly to educate, as I say, partly to sound a warning, and thirdly, to balance that, I guess, with a message, as I said, of hope, that I really do want this to be a positive and optimistic kind of experience for all of us. Christian people have documented in the history of the church the profound impact that they can have again and again and again. It always tends to be at moments of crisis. It always tends to be when things are getting out of hand, and Christian people, informed by the Word of God, get excited about that. And they come out of the woodwork and they start making noise, and things happen. And I'm just convinced enough that even a modest little effort like this class could start, at least in each of our lives, a little ripple effect, such that some very good and beneficial and positive things could happen. So that's what this class is about, at least in a kind of generalized way. Let me give you just a thumbnail sketch of the structure of the class, that is, what we'll be covering and when we'll be covering it. Tonight, we're going to analyze what I'm calling classical models for law. Classical models. And we'll, in both of our sessions, by the way, we'll have about a 40-minute session. We'll take a 10-minute break, come back for another 40 minutes, and I'll have you out of here at 9. I have to, because I always collapse at 9. My bedtime is 8:30, so you don't have to worry. I won't keep you late. I can promise you that. But in any event, that's the way that we'll structure our time together. The first time, our session tonight, our first objective is going to be to look at this that I'm calling classical models. Next week, we'll focus on the Reformation and the Puritan periods, which really are heirs of one of these classical models that I'm going to be talking about tonight. And of course, it was Puritanism which served as something of the conduit between the Reformation on the one hand and the formation of the Constitution of the United States on the other. That is, our Constitution, while it is not wholly a Reformation document, that's pretty obvious, but nevertheless there was a very significant contribution that can be traced straight back to the Protestant Reformation that formed part of the philosophical underpinnings of that document. And so what we want to do is trace that branch of Western thought first of all, Reformation, Puritanism, down to colonial America. And then in the following week, our third week together, we're going to look at another great branch that works its way through Western history, and that traces through the Renaissance and the so-called Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. And those two contributing philosophical sources more or less converge in an interesting sort of way, just a moment, really, in history, in terms of the big scheme. And yet in that moment in which those two traditions, the Reformation on the one hand and the Age of Reason on the other, they cross each other's paths, it just happens to be at that moment, you see, that our Constitution was drafted. And it was presupposing philosophical assumptions from those two traditions that gave something of the mentality out of which the constitutional documents were constructed. So what I'm saying is there was a philosophy that was at work in the minds of the framers. They were not necessarily biblical Christians. Ben Franklin, Tom Jefferson, those guys were not Christians. They were deists, but they were the heirs of a very significant contribution that had been there in America for about 150 years, you see, developing and entrenching its mentality and attitudes and values in the culture. And that was very instrumental at the time that the Constitution was actually being created. Our fifth week together is going to then focus on the I'm sorry, did I miss one? Fourth week. Okay, thank you. Fourth week together is going to actually look at the formulation of the Constitution itself. What are its component parts? What are the important assumptions that lie within it? And we'll try to show how we can see in the Constitution a reflection both of the Puritan heritage on the one hand and the Age of Reason on the other. In our fifth week together, then, we'll look at the great cataclysm that has taken place in constitutional history. It took place largely through the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, which was translated into jurisprudence through Oliver Wendell Holmes. And we'll see a radical shift in the way in which the document was handled and interpreted, and dare I say, rewritten from that point on. And then in our sixth week together, we'll begin to look at some of the consequences of that in terms of constitutional history and how some of the decisions that we now live with actually are justified in terms of an understanding of the Constitution, or at least a reconstruction, as it were, of the Constitution. These are big issues, and I have to say I feel very immodest, I guess, tackling something as big as this. My feeling is, well, who am I to be taking on these giant concerns? But my problem is I don't see anyone else doing it, you know. I wish that I saw some other people doing it, and I figure, well, if I go and if I try it and bungle it, at least maybe someone else will get the picture and do it right. But my point is, I feel like this is a message that someone needs to start, announcing, and there's a bell we need to start ringing here, because it's my conviction, at least, that there are some things that are at risk, seriously at risk, in our culture. That we're enjoying a certain degree of capital benefits off of traditions that we have abandoned. And so here we are living off of borrowed capital, you see, and it's going to run out. And what about our children? And what about our children's children? If those capital benefits are exhausted, what are we leaving for them? What philosophy are they going to be putting up with in terms of the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years? Those are my concerns, and that's really what has prompted this class. I suppose that from the first day of law school, I mean this almost literally, I had this class in my mind. And so I don't know if it's going to work or not. I may try it again sometime if this one fails, but in any event, this has been stirring for some time, and I appreciate your coming and being my guinea pigs to give this one a go. All right, well, with that much of an introduction, then I'd like to have a word of prayer, and we'll get started. Our Father, again, we are deeply grateful to you for the opportunity of gathering with your people. We thank you for this place. We thank you that we have the freedom, the liberty to gather in this way and to talk about these matters without fear. We pray that this precious benefit that's ours might be preserved and appreciated by people such as us. And that as a result of our time together, we might have a much deeper and more appreciative understanding of these great capital benefits of your grace that we enjoy in this country, and that we might be diligently about the business of preserving them. That we would rise to this occasion, as you've called us to, as courageous people who believe you and believe your word, and are committed to those things that are designed to make us your people and make us your courageous ambassadors in this world. We give you thanks for it in the name of Christ. Amen. Let me begin at a very simple and indeed simplistic level and ask you some questions for which the answers will seem to be obvious, but join me in this little simplistic excursion for a moment. I'd like you to think for a moment just about the question, what is law? What is it? We all live with it. We swim in a sea of law. You drove to this place this evening, presumably. You drove or rode with somebody, and getting into your car and driving out onto the city street, you're confronting law. You see signs, policemen out there with radar detectors watching you go by. You just did your taxes not too long ago, and that was law, you see, impinging itself upon your life. If you're in business, you're aware that there's a myriad number of laws that are touching you and threatening your very existence, at least your financial existence sometimes it seems. And again, we are confronted with the reality of law, almost to the extent that it seems to have a tangible, substantial existence. And yet, we know that law is in itself really nothing but words. It's words on paper. But it's not just any words on paper, is it? It's words that somehow have stuff to them, enforcement to them, power to them. The thing I'd like you to think about is, where do those laws come from? Sometimes we wonder, where they're coming from. We know that at least operationally, law comes from legislatures. We elect representatives. They sit in big rooms or small little committee meetings and hammer out law. But isn't there something that we intuitively, instinctively sense about law which tells us that it is more than just the result of a vote of some representatives in Olympia? To take an example so obvious that I hopefully makes my point, we think, for example, of laws against murder. Let's take something egregious, easy for us to feel. We know that there's a law, there's an RCW in the state of Washington that says it's wrong to commit murder, and if you do so, then you're going to be in big trouble. You see, we know that there's laws to that effect. But most of us, I think, sense that there's something in back of that law. That even if the words weren't there in some book spelling out the laws of this state, there would still be something, where? In our hearts? Somewhere, somehow, there'd be something telling us that's not right. And that really all the law has done is articulate a much more basic and instinctive sense about things. And that's why sometimes we'll hear that there's a law and we'll say, oh, that's a bad law. What do you mean by that? A bad law with reference to what? What are we comparing it to? By what measure do we look at a particular piece of legislation and say that's bad? You may recall not too long ago there was the catastrophic program for senior citizens. Some of you are familiar with that, aren't you? And there were a lot of people in this country that were saying, that's a bad law. You see. Well, what made it bad? I mean, the same legislature that enacted that law has enacted other laws that people would call good laws. And do you see what I'm saying? There's got to be something outside of the process itself by which we are making an evaluation. What is that? What is that? Well, that is a very difficult question. And we're not the first people who've wondered about that. Because you see, if we conclude that law is simply the product of legislative process, then that leaves us with the possibility of law simply being arbitrary. And we just make it up as we go along, and there's nothing outside of law by which law is measured. Well, we don't like that alternative. But if we say, on the other hand, that there's something outside of law, bigger than law, and that law itself is subject to it, then it almost gives us an excuse to obey the laws, because we really become answerable to some more transcendent abstraction out there. And that almost opens the door to anarchy, lawlessness. And there's been this ebb and flow, this discussion and debate down through the history of thought on this point, trying to figure that out. And what I'd like to suggest to you are what I'm calling two classical models, which were attempts to respond to the question, what is law and where does it come from? Both of my models are taken straight from paganism. And if any of you are distressed about that, I'm just going to beg you to indulge me for a moment. We're going to look at Plato, and then we're going to look at Aristotle, you see, our two great classical champions of two different responses to the question that I've just been posing. But then before we're done tonight, we're going to come back and look at a third alternative, which is the biblical or Judeo-Christian response to that, which I hope we'll appreciate a little bit more once we look at these other two thinkers and see how they dealt with it. So first of all, Plato. Now, I'm being very simple. If you have any real knowledge of philosophy, then you're going to recognize immediately that I'm misrepresenting both of these guys to some extent for the purpose of a rather abbreviated treatment of them. I apologize to you if you are offended by my simplistic handling of them. But at least I think for the purposes tonight, this is a fair representation. Plato kind of stands in ancient thought for the idea that law comes to us from outside of us. It comes down, as it were, from above. Aristotle, on the other hand, stands for the proposition that law comes, in a sense, from within us. And those are the two answers. It either comes from outside of us or comes from inside of us. You see, ultimately, we have to make, I think we can say that pretty much covers the waterfront in terms of possible ultimate sources for law. So let's look at Plato for a moment. This is my one and only transparency. You'll be really impressed. I spent hours on that, so I hope you appreciate it. This is my stab at reducing Platonism to a simple little diagram. I don't even know if you can read that in the back of the room. I imagine you can, so I'll try to translate that for you. But Plato postulates in his philosophy, I know many of you are familiar with this, so I'll just kind of run through it fairly quickly, but he postulates in his philosophy two worlds, or two orders of reality, one of which was called the ideal, and the other the receptacle. So in terms of my line, the first word on the top is ideal, on the bottom line is receptacle. The receptacle world is the world in which we live. So here we are in the receptacle world, but Plato states that there's another world, a world of greater reality, which is not immediately accessible to us, but is in fact more, in a sense, real than this world in which we live. And this is what he calls the ideal world. Now, I've put some terms after those two words to try to, at least in a brief kind of way, illustrate the difference. The ideal world is the world of essence, whereas this receptacle world is the world of existence. The ideal world is the world of the perfect, or the world of perfection, whereas this receptacle world is the world of imperfection. The ideal world is the world of the absolute. That is, it doesn't change, it's normative. Whereas this world, the receptacle world, is the world of the relative, the absolute and the relative. And finally, the ideal world is the world of order. Plato was concerned about order. That might be the main thing that disturbed him and drove him in his philosophical work, was to try to find a basis for order. Whereas, and I had to tuck this down, second line down, but the last word there on the lower side is disorder. Now, Plato's point, and this is very strategic to Platonism and to all of the thinking that came after him, is that this ideal world is not simply something we are projecting. It's not just an invention of our minds. It is really there. It is really out there. And Plato says it has to be there, else we can make no sense out of this world. Now think about this for a moment. The typical example that's used by philosophy professors to illustrate this is the chair. I don't know if Plato used that, but it's become the example. But there is the chair. There's several of them in this room. And even though many of them look alike, some of them are cushy, but most of them are these folding kind that aren't too comfortable. Even though they look alike, they're all a little bit different, aren't they? But we are aware that there are all kinds of chairs. There's some chairs further back and the $3 seats back there, and they have little padding, you see, on the bottom of them. They're a little more comfortable. There's some sofas in here. And we see chairs all the time, and yet I think most of us would allow that we've probably never seen in our life the perfect chair. And the question Plato raises is, well, how do you know something's a chair when you see it? And of course, the great answer that he gives is, you don't know something's a chair because you see it as the perfect, ideal chair, but it does resemble the perfect, ideal chair, which is up there in the ideal world. It participates in what Plato calls chairness. You see? Know that? So when you see a chair in this world, it may not be perfect, but it resembles the ideal chair, participates in the essence of chairness. And Plato is saying that unless there is that perfect chair, we really have no basis for calling anything in this world by the name chair, you see. Now, that may seem pretty innocuous on the point of chairs, but let's up the ante a little bit. He also makes the same point about humanity. That is, that not only can we carry on this discussion in terms of chairs, but we can talk about what we are or what we ought to be as human beings. And Plato's point is that when we look at each other, we're imperfect. Some of us look a little better than others. Some of us think a little better than others do. Some of us, have greater or lesser degrees of social finesse, and so on. We can all kinds of things we could mention which represent distinguishing qualities among us, and yet somehow in our minds we're aware that there is that ideal person, the ideal human. And in a sense we evaluate people in terms of how do they correspond to that ideal. Now, part of what Plato's driving at is that the ideal involves, among other things, an idea of the good. So this ideal human being in the ideal world does what is ideally good at all times. He is an ideal person with a perfect ethical behavior. So as we live out our lives in this world, we are continually having to judge our behavior in terms of this ideal. And that's how we know the difference between right and wrong. All right. That's a little abstract, but let's make it more concrete. You're driving down City Street in Spokane, and you come to an intersection. And at that intersection, you look and behold a, quote, little old lady. Now, none of you in this room fit that criterion, you see. So I know I'm not speaking of any of you here, but you can imagine such a person. And this person is standing at a typical street corner where she's waiting for the light to flash walk. But you're aware that it's one of the typical crosswalks in Spokane where the walk only shows for about 3 seconds, and then it's don't walk, and this person is going to have a very difficult time negotiating a busy intersection, and you're there at the intersection, and you are faced, and for purposes of simplicity, we're going to reduce your alternatives to 2. You have 2 alternatives in dealing with this individual who's standing at the intersection. One of your alternatives is to get out of your car and go over and help this person cross the street, to help and assist in this difficult prospect that she's facing. The other alternative that you have is to, with cunning, wait for her to step out in front of your car and then mow her down. Okay? Those are your 2 alternatives. Now I want you to think about something for a moment. I suspect that very few of you in this room, if any, would opt for the second alternative. And if you would opt for it, I don't want to meet you, okay? In fact, our reaction to that proposition, as I spelled it out to you, provokes something in you. Now, what I want you to ask yourself is this. Why did you respond the way you did? You saw one, now maybe, what you would actually do at the corner is just sit there and wait. I mean, a third alternative might be open, but I'm not giving you that alternative. You've got two choices. Either help her or mow her down. Those are your choices. And you found one of those choices to be unthinkable. Why did you find it to be unthinkable? Is it because there's a law somewhere, in a statute, in Olympia, or in a law library that says don't mow down little old ladies at corners? Is that why you found that so absurd? Plato would say, no. Your reaction proves my point. That you know down deep inside you, and no legislature has to tell you, that there are certain things that are ideally right. And they really and truly are there. They're not just the inventions of your mind. They're not just the result of your upbringing. There is something fundamentally imprinted and implanted in our humanness that tells us that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. And I could give you 1,000 different examples besides my little old lady example, and you would feel the same way about each one of them. Again and again, this profoundly consistent response to ethical dilemmas. Plato says, where did that come from? And his answer is it came from somewhere else. It came from a world of absolute ethical truth. Plato gives us a certain philosophy of law and philosophy of ethics which has survived and continues to survive right down to this day. Namely, that ultimately the categories of right and wrong are not invented by us, but delivered to us. And that when we make those distinctions, we're not making them because we've simply sat down and decided, well, this is the most appropriate way for us to live, as if we could invent these values on our own. But something bigger than we are has imposed these standards and indeed, in a sense, written them in our consciousness. And they are there to such an extent that you would laugh when I propose to you that you violate it. That's Plato's answer. It's a fairly sophisticated analysis, really, of human understanding. Now, there's 3 terms that I'd like to teach you in connection with Plato. And the first of these terms is the term idealism. The next one is realism. And the last one is rationalism. So if we describe Plato, we would describe him by those 3 terms. He is, number 1, an idealist, which is to say, he asserts that there are true and genuine ideals. That these are not just fictions or imaginations of our own minds, but that there are real ideals. But the next word helps us understand that they are real. Usually we think of idealism and realism as opposites, don't we? We think some people are idealistic and some people are realistic. But in philosophy, that's not the way it works. Plato is an idealist in that he postulates there are ideals. He's a realist in that he says there are really ideals. In other words, these are not just projections of our imagination. They're really there, somewhere. And then finally, he's a rationalist, which is to say that he begins and moves in a kind of deductive process in which you begin with a major or universal principle. That's the major premise, as it were. Then you come to a particular human situation, which may be like the minor premise. You take the major premise and the minor premise, and looking at the one in light of the other, draw a conclusion deductively. And Plato says that in a sense is how ethics works. We're confronted with ethical dilemmas in life. It's the minor premise. We compare the minor premise to a major premise of ethical perfection and draw a conclusion. It's right or it's wrong. We do this so instinctively We're not even conscious of it. But it's a rational process. It's happening in our mind. Okay, one final comment on Platonism, and then we'll take a quick break. There's two more words. I know I'm barraging you with words this evening. If these are all new terms, we'll be reusing them. We're going to recycle these words, so it won't be this bad every week. But these are words we should know. The first of these is the word ontology, and the second of these words is epistemology. There are two branches of philosophical concern. Ontology has to do with being, and epistemology has to do with knowing. Now, if we analyze Platonism in terms of these two words, here's what we come up with. Plato is ontologically strong, but epistemologically weak. And that's the whole problem with an ethical theory predicated along Platonic lines. What does that mean? It's ontologically strong in that Plato says the ethics in this world upon which we base our lives are rooted in real values that really exist. And thus our ethics have some kind of eternal, fixed, absolute norm by which they can be validated. In other words, our ethics don't simply float in the whims of our minds. They have real, substantial existence because they are really related to real ideals. That's ontology, and ontologically, Plato is very strong. Gives us a good, solid basis for ethics. That's always been the great strength of Platonism. What's the problem? Is epistemologically fatally flawed. Epistemology has to do with knowing. Being and knowing, you see. The problem with Plato's epistemology is, even if there is this ideal world, how do we know about it? You ever been there? I don't recall ever visiting the place. I don't recall ever seeing chair nests. And how in the world do we know that there is such a place? I mean, I like the idea, Mr. Plato. I mean, it strikes me as a very lovely concept, but that's what it is. It's a concept. And unless I can go and check it out, unless I can empirically examine it, unless I can, test it and try it, find it's really there, how do I know that it's not anything more than pure speculation? And if it's pure speculation, then this wonderful ontological basis for your morality has just collapsed because we couldn't verify that there was such a foundation. That's the problem with Plato. Ontologically, wonderful. Epistemologically, a fatal weakness. Plato did answer that. He said, well, we know about that ideal world because we recall it. We were all there in another lifetime. That solves that problem, doesn't it, you see? If you just think about it for a while, you'll remember that you were in the ideal world before you were born. Well, I don't know, maybe that satisfies you, but some of the other people who've looked at that response have found it wanting. Others who have followed a Platonic philosophy have concluded, have used different techniques, some kind of mystical, intuitive leap into the ideal world or ideal understanding, but all of these have finally kind of fallen short of giving us a true sense